I don't believe it.
FRO Radio Kick e Tom, ascoltatela tutti. Sì, vai. Mandala. Parte la sigla direttamente da Pavia. Ecco il fischio, adesso tutti via. Se senti la mia voce, sei nel posto giusto. Ci sono Tom e Checco che ti narrano con gusto tutto lo sport che si possa desiderare. Sentiamo i commenti da un top professionale, dal calcio al basket, ma zero pattinaggio. E poi arriva Checco con suo stile da pagliaccio. Connettiti alla radio, dai, non paghi niente. Alla fine l'importante è informare la gente, con un po' di ironia, ma non manca l'eleganza. Se parte un insulto, non è la fattanza. Ascolta pure il derby con giudizi molto rari. Si sente in sottofondo troppo brutto montari. Ora è il tempo di partire, tutti pronti in diretta. Ascolta che coi Tom, la radio perfetta.
Buon pomeriggio da Tommaso Marconi, Sport Connecting People, episodio 16 febbraio, episodio numero 4. Benvenuti al nostro appuntamento di sport e cultura, tutto in inglese, a parte la mia voce che non si avventura in imprese che non può sostenere. Andiamo a presentare quello di cui parleremo oggi, cioè ovviamente la puntata spaccata in due con i nostri servizi, quello di Ivan Fowler, Sport in Shakespeare, e ci sarà il racconto dell'Archery, tiro con l'arco, con diversi riferimenti che andremo a scoprire con Ivan, poi con Michael Richards, la sua consueta intervista. Stavolta parleremo di kickboxing con Josh, un ragazzo che viene dall'America. Allora, siccome Ivan alla fine del suo spazio introduce Michael, direi che noi ci risentiamo semplicemente alla fine dei due servizi, quindi prima Ivan, poi Michael con Josh, e allora buon Sport Connecting People.
Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Sport in Literature. My name is Ivan Fowler and I work for the Cultural Association The World of Tales of Pavia, and you're listening to Radio Kekko and Tom. Thank you Kekko and thank you Tom. Now today we have another chat, or should I say ramble, about sport in Shakespeare. This is number 4, so we've had tennis in Henry V, we've had bowls in Hamlet, and we also had fencing in Romeo and Juliet. Now, today's topic is kind of connected to the last topic, because last week I was talking about Romeo and Juliet, in other words, about love, and, well, St. Valentine's Day has just passed, and we're still sort of on the topic of love, with our sport today, archery. So archery obviously is shooting with a bow and arrows. In fact, a person who plays this sport, you can either call them a bowman or a bowwoman nowadays, or an archer. So we have these two options in English. Well, where to begin? Because archery, just like sword fighting, like fencing last week, really is an ancient sport. It has tremendously ancient origins. For example, going back all the way to 3300 BC, a gentleman died, actually was killed by an arrow probably, when he was crossing the Alps. We don't know his name, but nowadays they call him Ötzi. He was frozen in a glacier, and he stayed in the ice for, about 5,000 years. As a consequence, when he was discovered, he's one of the best preserved examples of human beings living in Europe 5,000 years ago. And with him was all his equipment that included knives, tools, and also a bow and arrow. Now, Ötzi's bow and arrow was of the kind we call the long bow. and it's really the star of our episode today. The longbow will be familiar to you from films about Robin Hood. Yep, that's right. So, Robin Hood, when he shoots an arrow, he uses a bow, which is not squared off, is not square like most modern bows are. So the shaft of the bow, that's the long wooden bit, is rounded, not squared. It's very long. It's nearly 2 meters long. It's practically the same height as the person. And it is not very curved. It's almost straight. And these characteristics are what we call the long bow. It's a very special bow. It has some technical disadvantages in that, it's not very powerful in proportion to other bows. Other bows can be a lot shorter and much more powerful, and it's not very mechanical. But this is actually the advantage. It's not very mechanical. It's very fast to use. And in history, this was the big advantage of the longbow. You can prepare the arrow on the string and draw, which is pull back the string, and shoot very, very quickly. So particularly in medieval England, the longbow was a weapon of choice for the military, and it had devastating effects in battles between about 1350 and 1450. For about 100 years, the longbow dominated warfare before cannons and guns came into use. So the longbow, yes, has very ancient origins. It was used by Ötzi 5,300 years ago, and more recently by Robin Hood and other Englishmen in the Middle Ages. This leads me to one of the links I've included today, which is another scene from Kenneth Branagh's Henry V film. It's a representation of the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, and that is one battle in the 100 Years' War between England and France, which the English won thanks to good planning, good strategy, of course, but really thanks to the longbow, because the English had this policy. The policy was that in free time, summertime, any time at all you had that was not for working, in England, young men would not play football, they would not play tennis, they would not go swimming, they would practice with the longbow. That was the official government policy. In fact, during the 100 Years' War, in this period, from the time of King Edward III through to King Henry V, it was illegal to play football. You couldn't play football. You were supposed to practice with the longbow. That was your duty. So that, when it came to war, when the king needed archers or bowmen for a battle, he would have a ready supply of young Englishmen with a strong arm who could fire bows and arrows. Now, this practice continued all the way through to the time of Shakespeare. So we know, for example, that in the time of Henry VIII, for example, the Mary Rose, his beautiful flagship, which sank and was rediscovered by archaeologists, the Mary Rose has a lot of bows and arrows on board. And that was in 1545, nearing the time of Shakespeare. In 1588, when England was preparing to fight the Spanish Armada, we talked about that in our episode 2 weeks ago about bowls. Well, when the English were preparing to fight the Spanish Armada, they organized a militia, so a kind of home army, civilian army, which included about 1,600 archers. And these were longbowmen, so they were using the longbow, just like Robin Hood. So it remained popular right up until the time of Shakespeare, when Shakespeare was a young man. Why did people stop using the longbow in battle? Well, because of cannons and firearms, guns essentially. And it's quite interesting that the first battle in history where handheld firearms, so what's the difference between handheld and non-handheld? So if you hold it in your hands, it's handheld. Obviously, cannons are not handheld. Cannons had been used for about 100 years before this, okay? But actually more than 100 years before. The handheld firearms, guns essentially, were not used effectively in a battle until the Battle of Pavia in 1525. That was the first battle in history, really, that was won by firearms, handheld firearms, by the gun. And it's such an important battle in history that even in England, in the Military Museum of Leeds, you will find a huge display totally dedicated to the Battle of Pavia. However, in the popular imagination, bows and arrows have never been replaced. Nobody holding a gun, not even Clint Eastwood or Matt Damon, I don't care who they are, nobody holding a gun will ever be as romantic and sexy as Robin Hood firing his longbow, shooting his longbow. Well, the fact of the matter is that the longbow is the bow that William Shakespeare refers to in his literature. And here we're talking about a Shakespeare play that is not so well known. So we've spoken about very famous plays, Henry V, Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, can't get more famous than that. Well, here is a much less well-known play. It's a comedy called Love's Labour's Lost. And essentially, it's a romantic comedy, as Shakespeare used to write. However, it's not very popular today probably because it has a lot of references to politicians and aristocrats of the time of Shakespeare. So this was funny and interesting for people at the time because they were familiar with these people. But afterwards, the play was not so popular simply because these people were no longer around. People don't know who they are. You know, the Prince of Navarre and King Henry IV of France. You know, these are not relevant contemporary politicians anymore. It's as though somebody writing today wrote a play about Matteo Renzi and Berlusconi, and then 200 years later, people watching the play say, huh? Who are those people? So that's what happened to Love's Labour's Lost. It's not a bad play, it's just not famous because the people in it are not relevant anymore. Now, I'm going to be quoting to you today from Act 4, Scene 1 of Love's Labour's Lost. And in this scene, basically there is a dialogue that is all about love, but the metaphor for love is archery, is shooting. So first we have a man and a woman, Boyer and Rosaline. They're on stage. And Boyer, he has a suspicion. He thinks that Rosaline is in love and that she wants to marry someone. So he's trying to find out from her. He's trying to discover if she is in love and who she is in love with. And their friends, well, Boye's friends, are listening to the conversation because they're curious. They want to know about Rosaline. You know, they're gossiping. So there are Boye's friends Maria and also Cotard, and they are listening while Boye is questioning Rosaline about love. And practically every line contains a metaphor from archery. So archery is the metaphor for love. Of course, this is an ancient metaphor. We know that Cupid is a representation of love. Cupid shoots arrows into people's hearts and then they fall in love. So there's nothing new about this. It's nothing original to Shakespeare. So Boye asks Rosaline, who is the suitor? Who is the shooter? Now, suitor in English means a person who wants to marry another person. So he's saying, who is in love? Who wants to marry? Rosaline replies, shall I teach you to know? Boye says, well, yes, my continent of beauty. Now, just an aside here. That's a great compliment. My continent of beauty. Wow. Nice one, Shakespeare. So, listeners, next year on St. Valentine's Day, you could use this compliment for your loved one. My continent of beauty. Wow. Anyway, Rosaline replies, why, she that bears the bow. So the suitor is she that bears the bow. Bear just means hold. And so the person holding the bow is the suitor. Boye continues, my lady goes to kill horns. Now horns, of course, are the horns on the head of a deer. So this is a reference to archery as a sport, shooting deer. Just like people go shooting with guns today to kill deer. Well, Rosaline replies, she confesses, she says, well then, I am the shooter. Now, this is a nice play on words because shooter and suitor sound very similar in English. And they rhyme. In fact, all of this conversation is rhyming. And so it would sound fun on stage when it's performed. And they have a similar meaning. The shooter, the archer, is the suitor, the one who wants to marry, if you think of archery as a metaphor for love. Boye says, who is your dear? So who are you shooting? Who are you in love with? Now, Rosaline, she does not want to tell him. Boye complimented her a moment ago. He said that she was a continent of beauty. Well, she says, if we choose by the horns, yourself come not near. So she says, if we're choosing by the horns, by physical appearance, by stature, you will not come near. So she's insulting him. She's saying, well, it's definitely not you. You're not good looking enough. And so Boye is a little bit offended. But Rosaline says, thou canst not hit it. Thou canst not hit it, my good man. And so Rosaline leaves the stage with this. She exits. Now, when Rosaline says, thou canst not hit it, she's using an archaic form in English, thou. Thou is not used in English today, but it was originally the second person singular. And it was the intimate form of address for another person in English. So today this is not used anymore. And we use you, which is the second person plural, which was the formal address in English. So the intimate personal thou is not used anymore. And we only use the formal address you. So for Italian listeners, it's as though the word tu was not used anymore. And we only used lei or voi. Actually, you is voi. And when she says canst, thou canst not hit it. Canst is the second person singular of can. And it sounds very unfamiliar to listeners today, but that's what it is. Anyway, Rosaline has left the stage, and Boyer is now talking to his friends Maria and Cotard, who were listening. Remember, they were listening, they want to gossip, they want to know who Rosaline is in love with. And Maria says to Boyer, "A mark, marvelous, well shot," for they both did hit it. Now, a mark. The mark is like the target, what you are aiming at. And she says, "Marvelous, well shot." You shot really well there. Shot is the past of shoot. And Boyer, he's celebrating. "A mark, oh mark, but that mark, a mark, says my lady." So he's celebrating. He hit the mark. He got the information from Rosaline, the information that she was the shooter in love. And, well, Boyer continues saying, "Let the mark have a prick in it to meet it at, if it may be." Now, let the mark of the target have a prick in it. Well, what is a prick? Okay, now this is where we get to discover the more saucy side of Shakespeare. Because prick is a verb, meaning to penetrate. It's used by Shakespeare in many contexts. For example, there's a famous quote from The Merchant of Venice. "If you prick us, do we not bleed?" So if you prick, with the point of a knife or with a needle, you prick a person, they bleed. We'll talk about The Merchant of Venice another day. In any case, prick in this case means the arrow has penetrated the target, the mark. So the mark has a prick in it. However, let's think for a moment. Why is archery a metaphor for love, and why has it always been a metaphor for love, even since ancient times when people believed in Cupid and Eros? Well, I think you can use your imagination. However, suffice to say that still in modern English, prick has a double sense, and I'm sure it had a double sense at the time of Shakespeare too. So Shakespeare's, playing with language here. He's having fun at this point. The audience is starting to laugh. Cotard, the other friend, says, "Oh, you must shoot nearer or you'll never hit the clout." The clout is another word for target, another word for the mark. And they continue talking in this way. "And if my hand be out, then belike your hand is in." You can use your imagination. "Then will she get the upshoot by cleaving the pin." Then will she get the upshoot by cleaving the pin. Cleave means to cut. The pin is like a needle. It's something you use to prick. Okay, you can understand where this conversation is going. In fact, Maria says very soon, Come, you talk greasily." Grease meaning fat, meaning dirty. You're talking dirty now. "Your lips grow foul." Foul is another word for disgusting. So your lips in your mouths are becoming foul. They're becoming disgusting. She's basically saying, boys, this conversation is getting dirty. Let's stop. So, in any case, getting back to our conversation about bowls in Hamlet, Cotard replies to Boyer. He says, "She is too hard for you at pricks, sir. Challenge her to bowl." So, she's not in for archery, Boyer. She doesn't want to play archery with you. Why don't you challenge her to bowl? And if you remember from our second episode what rub means, Boyer says, "I fear too much rubbing. Good night, my good owl." And so the conversation mercifully has finished there. So you get an idea that when Shakespeare was writing, He was not above using sexual innuendo, double meanings, and what we call lewd humor. Lewd, that's a great word in English. L-E-W-D. L-E-W-D, meaning with sexual references, sexual overtones. There's a lot of that in Shakespeare. Well, that was an example of archery used as a metaphor for love and as a metaphor for something a bit more physical than simple platonic love. And all of these words like mark, clout, shoot, the horns, the deer, all of these words were so familiar to Shakespeare's audiences that it was very immediate, it was very funny, very spontaneous to listen to that conversation. Another reason why this play is not famous today is probably because this kind of humor is not easy to understand anymore. We don't understand archery metaphors so easily today because we don't use the bow and arrow in daily life. It's no longer a feature of everybody's lives. Sure, some people practice archery as a sport, but not a large percentage of the population. So it's not spontaneous for us. We have to stop. We have to think. If you have to think about humor, it's not funny, quite simply. So Love's Labour's Lost is not very funny today. It talks about politicians that nobody knows about anymore. It uses metaphors that we don't understand anymore. It's not one of Shakespeare's plays to really survive well into the modern age. However, I just want to say something about Shakespeare here in general. Shakespeare is so popular, is so famous today, that I think a lot of people assume that he's very serious, very high culture, very high class literature. No, he's not. He was commercial literature. He was writing for the stage. He was writing for an audience of people who were paying to go and listen. It was like Hollywood. They wanted humor. They wanted violence. They wanted sex. They wanted drugs. They wanted rock and roll. Okay, rock and roll hadn't been invented, but the equivalent of the time. And that is what Shakespeare gave them. Inside that context of commercial, fun writing for the stage, for the theatre, there is the genius that is Shakespeare. But it's not high class. It's not serious. It's not highbrow culture, as we say in English, okay? It's fun. It's really good fun. Sex, drugs, violence, rock and roll, it's got everything. And lots of humor, lots of humor. So that's Love's Labour's Lost, and that is archery as a metaphor for love and much, much more. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Sport in Literature, and I'll hand you over now to Michael, who's going to interview an American kickboxer called Josh Wood. So that's going to be fun. Tune in next week for another episode.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 4th episode of Sports and Culture. My name is Michael Richards, and I am working with the Cultural Association of the World of Tells. This week, our person that we are interviewing is from America, but he's in Canada at the moment, and the topic of today is kickboxing. Let me introduce to you Josh Wood. Hello, Josh. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing all right. How are you?
Yeah, fantastic. For the listeners out there, can you explain a little bit about where you've been over the last 10 years so they can get an idea of why your accent is the way it is at the moment?
Yeah, well, my accent will drift a little bit. I spent better part of a year over in the UK, predominantly Scotland, about 10 years ago. Raised in the Midwest, raised in Minnesota in the United States, so that gives me a kind of very traditional American accent. But from there, I went to the UK, and then I met an Australian girl, got married, and moved to Australia, and I've been in Australia for 8 years. And then just recently, about 2 weeks ago, I moved to Canada, so my accent will fly all over the place.
Fantastic. And today we're going to talk to you about kickboxing. How did you get into kickboxing, Josh?
It's funny. I was sort of 17 years old, I think, so about 11 years ago, and I was working in a computer shop in high school, fixing computers. I did hardware stuff and a bit of debugging and antivirus things. Yeah. And one day I was just like, I want to learn kickboxing. I was playing on the internet. I thought kickboxing sounded cool. I did a bunch of research, and nobody in my town taught kickboxing.
Yeah, right.
So I was like, well, what can I do? Well, what I found was a sport called MMA, mixed martial arts. You see it in the UFC.
Yep.
And we had a Brazilian guy who rented about 10 meters square in the back of an old Irish boxing gym downtown. And he was a medical doctor from Brazil who came to the U.S. to practice medicine, decided that he'd rather just teach people how to fight. And so that's what he did. Okay. And I started learning MMA from him back in 2006. And ever since then, it's been just a progression of MMA, kickboxing, more Muay Thai style kickboxing. Did Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for a lot of years. Then took a bit of a break from that. Powerlifted for about 3 years before getting into boxing, and that's sort of been what I've been doing for the last 3 years consistently.
Okay, so with kickboxing, what is it exactly for the listeners out there? Because there might be a bit of confusion between kickboxing and Muay Thai, for example. Can you explain a little bit about kickboxing and Muay Thai and what the differences are? Yeah,
so it's kickboxing is an overarching term. It's sort of a sporting term. So kickboxing is generally considered a sport, not so much an individual style, although it's becoming more and more its own style. Okay. So kickboxing is any sort of combat sport in which you use the hands and feet to strike. Whereas Muay Thai would be, I guess, a subset of that, in which not only do you use the hands and feet to fight in a ring, like a boxing ring,
okay.
But you can also use knees and elbows, and there's clinch work, which is basically stand-up wrestling.
Okay.
So it's a subset of that hands and feet combat. But there's a lot of little subsets, but Muay Thai is probably the most popular.
Okay. And with the clinching you were talking about, you can do the clinching in both kickboxing and Muay Thai?
No, only in Muay Thai.
Only in Muay Thai.
Yeah, there is, I believe, some clinch work allowed in certain Asian-based kickboxing associations. So, like K1 being one of the big ones, okay. They went out a long time. It's basically Muay Thai. You're allowed some clinch fighting, but you can't throw any knees or elbows.
Right.
So the big thing with Muay Thai is those knees and elbows in clinch fighting, and then there's like little subsets around the world depending on the promotion.
Okay, fantastic. And where did it come from? Was it a derivative of Muay Thai, or it just came about randomly?
Well, I mean, we can go back all the beginning of time and find me a little boy somewhere who hasn't punched or kicked another little boy. Like, you're gonna find kicking and boxing all over the place. But if we're looking at modern sport kickboxing,
Yeah.
you're going to see that the sporting aspect really came about that on a world scale from Japan in about the 60s, and then the Americans caught on in the 70s, and that's where you saw like sport kickboxing.
Yeah, right.
If we're looking at it
no
as
idea about that.
yeah, well, because there's a lot of the kickboxing techniques come out of karate and various styles of taekwondo as well, like the kicking stuff. Because if we're talking sport kickboxing as opposed to a smaller subset being Muay Thai, you don't have those knees and elbows, and you don't see a lot of knees and elbows in most styles of karate.
Yeah.
So that tailored well, and that's where we saw the first like big tournaments coming out of Japan in the 60s, and then in the 70s, the U.S. American style kickboxing caught on. But if we look at the lineage, Muay Thai is one of the first like self-defense styles of kickboxing.
Okay.
Prior to that, it was Muay Baran, and this was a sort of military art. It was self-defense, and it was taught to the military. There were competitions, but back then it was predominantly bare knuckle.
Right.
So we see that sporting aspect coming way back in Thailand, but it evolved out of the sort of military background. Whereas if we're looking at modern day kickboxing, like sport kickboxing, that really started in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, very interesting. And the rules of kickboxing, basically, so rules of kickboxing: no clinching, no elbows, no knees, and using your feet and your hands to punch and kick is the basic.
Yeah, more or less. Like, because you've got a few major rule sets. You've got like the full contact rule set, which is your American kickboxing. You got international rules. You got K1. You've got Muay Thai.
Okay.
So if we look at your standard like international American style kickboxing, it's basically a mix of boxing, karate. So you can strike with the hands, you can strike with the feet, but you can only strike above the waist.
Right. Okay.
So you got gloves, you got mouth guard, and the amateurs you have shin guards and headgear, but you can only strike with punches and kicks above the waist. No clinch, no throwing, no sweeps.
Yep.
And as you go down the scale, you got international rules, which allow you to strike below the waist. Still no knees, no elbows. K1 was the closest to Muay Thai, and that's with knees but no elbows.
Okay.
Above and below the waist. And there's other variations where a lot of times you're only allowed to kick, like in French kickboxing, Savat, you're only allowed to kick with the foot, whereas like Muay Thai style kicks are with the shin.
Okay. And the one you practiced predominantly, which one did you prefer to practice when you were practicing kickboxing?
I mean, it's going to be the biggest influence from Muay Thai, but because I'm predominantly a boxer, it would be probably closer to what we'd call Dutch kickboxing, where the Dutch dominated kickboxing when it became a world sport. And the Dutch, big, strong people. They have a lot of Muay Thai gyms. They love the kickboxing, but they take a lot of those Muay Thai kicks and strikes, but they put it on a boxing foundation. So we see a lot more of the footwork that you get in boxing, that westernized sport, and the striking with the fists, which really changed the game. Because in Muay Thai, you don't see a lot of punching, and you don't see that boxing style of punching. You don't see that type of footwork, the changing of angles. Muay Thai is very patient, where boxing tends to be all about creating that setup. And so the Dutch, they put those two together and they create this really dominant form of kickboxing. So some of the best kickboxers that you'll see in the world have been Dutch.
Right.
Or that style of kickboxing. And so that's sort of where my kickboxing would be, because I'm much more hands dominant just because of my background and the way, competing in boxing and stuff like that.
Is that the Dutch became dominant when after it came out of Japan, or that was from
I would probably say the 80s through the 90s when it became sort of international. They really dominated like K1.
Yeah.
Because they had the kicks above and below, which kicking is a big part of Muay Thai, and especially the leg kick. The leg kick is huge in Muay Thai. It's huge in MMA. You see it because you take out someone's legs, they can't go anywhere.
Exactly.
So when you had that rule set, the Dutch really seemed to dominate in that style of kickboxing.
And with kickboxing, is it like you were mentioning that it was sort of modeled a little bit on karate when it came out of Japan. Are there also levels in kickboxing as well? Like, do you start at, I don't know, a yellow belt, or like, are there belts or levels involved? Like, how does that work?
If we look at grading, it's a combat sport, so typically there's no grading. So you don't have grades in boxing, you don't have grades in wrestling. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu does. Kickboxing typically doesn't. But what you're seeing more and more in the West is this adoption of some sort of ranking system in like Muay Thai and the MMA schools. So I've been to a few gyms where they use colored armbands, so up over the bicep, that you see typically in Muay Thai.
Okay.
So it'd be like a rubber band with a color. The other option I've seen is like colored tank tops or colored singlets that represent your rank as well. But really, traditionally, it's all about skill level and experience.
And when you start training for kickboxing, what is the typical training that you start doing initially? How does that work?
It kind of depends. If you see, or if you do any training in sort of any of the Asian traditions, more often than not, it's not a systemized form of education in an art. So, like when I did like Muay Thai, or I did judo, things like that are more traditional karate. You kind of get thrown in the deep end, where it's like, all right, we're going to make you work really hard. So you're going to run, you're going to do a lot of calisthenics, push-ups, sit-ups, blah, 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 a lot of just conditioning. And then you're going to fight people, sparring. So it's not a real fight, but you're going to be thrown in and you're going to get a little beat up as you figure out what's going on. Whereas in the West, things are taught in levels. So instead of just learning by experience, you learn by education. You learn by being taught. So in a lot of, say, kickboxing, MMA, boxing sort of realms, you learn the basics. You start off, this is how you stand. This is where you hold your hands. Now we're going to start off with your basic punches and your basic kicks, and you're going to drill them.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of a difference in education.
Is this the type of education that you would prefer, or would you prefer a combination of the two, or I don't know, what do you think?
Well, the way I run my classes and the way that I prefer to work with people is you take a technique, a set of techniques, and you learn them. You take your foundations, and you practice them, and you practice them, and you practice them, and you become conditioned doing those things. I've been in sort of traditional martial arts schools, and it's like, I don't know what's happening. And they're like, no, just practice. And I'm like, I haven't learned anything. And you
what
start
do I do?
you feel a little bit lost, but you learn through watching and doing and getting your ass handed to you.
Okay.
Which you don't forget those lessons, but you also don't necessarily master good technique in the beginning. You get the technique better as you move along, whereas I definitely prefer, like, I'd rather have one or two techniques very good that I've practiced and I'm confident with than a handful of techniques that I kind of know and can kind of muscle my way through. So I'm definitely more a fan of, at least when I teach and the way I like to learn, is to take a technique or set of techniques, practice them, and then try and implement them in live practice.
Sorry, can I call you Joshua or Josh?
Either's fine. Most people just call me Josh.
Yeah, alright, fantastic. With the actual fights themselves, how do they work? Is it similar to boxing? Are there rounds, bouts? How long do they last for? Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah. So a round is called a bout. A match. A match and a bout are the same thing.
Okay.
So you can have a bout of boxing, a bout of kickboxing. They're all rounds based. So it depends on which style of training or which style you're fighting in. So your full contact or your American style, kickboxing runs 3 to 12 rounds like boxing. And those are 2 to 3 minutes with a 1 minute rest. International rules are just 2 minute rounds. K1, 3 to 5 rounds, again at the 3 minute mark with a 1 minute rest. They're all sort of sitting in that range. I think Muay Thai is usually 3 minute rounds, but you have 5 of them with the 1 minute rest. So 2 or 3 minutes per round, 1 minute rest, anywhere from 3 to 12 rounds, depending on the rule set.
Okay.
Just like boxing.
There's one question that I wanted to ask. Maybe some viewers out there have also witnessed a Muay Thai or kickboxing match at some point. The one question I wanted to ask was, what is the headband that competitors wear when they go into the ring? Have you seen that? What is that?
So that's part of sort of the traditional garb that Muay Thai fighters will wear, and it comes down to a lot of their tradition. So you'll see the armbands, you'll see the headband, and you'll see the traditional dance, the white crew, which they perform to both, bring in good energy. A lot of it's prayer based. You'll see them usually shoot or pretend to shoot like an arrow or something at their opponent to sort of psych them out, and then to give thanks to their teachers. And the headband and the armbands are all part of that ceremony. The headband comes off, obviously, because it's a little bit dangerous to have. But it's usually one of those things that's handed down through the lineage. So, like, a teacher will have a headband for spiders, and I'm missing the terminology. I can't remember what they're called. And a lot of times they're sacred things. So sometimes they have like prayers in them, or they have spells, because there's a lot of magic in the Thai traditions. Oh, okay.
And speaking of customs and traditions, like when you first start training with your master, what are some of the traditions that occur? I mean, you just touched on a couple with different prayers that happen, but say, for example, over the duration of a class or even a competition, what are the different types of traditions that or customs that occur in kickboxing?
Honestly, there aren't many in kickboxing, because kickboxing is very much contemporary and Western.
Okay.
In Muay Thai, very tradition-based, because they have lineages of fighters, lineages of teachers. The crew or the teacher is very sacred. He's the be-all and end-all of your training. You show a lot of respect, and you do everything they say. And so there's a lot of tradition and magic, and you got lineages of fighters, and teachers whose teachers taught them, and they go back 3 generations, and they own the school, and so very tradition based. And there's a lot of ritual with the prayers and the dance and the giving of thanks to both your teacher and gods and things like that. Whereas in the West, you don't really have that spiritual aspect that you see in a lot of Eastern traditions. The most you have for rituals is maybe if there is an Eastern background, maybe karate, taekwondo, that kind of thing. You bow when you come into the gym or before you step on the mats.
Yeah.
Bow, get off. No shoes on the mats usually if it's kickboxing. But yeah, there's not a lot of like real traditions. There's ritual, like there's the wrapping of hands and getting set up for class and your warm up, which for a lot of people is ritual, but not necessarily a standardized ritual.
Sure. And with misconceptions, are there misconceptions about the sport of kickboxing that people often talk about or say to you, and you say, no, this is not what kickboxing is? Like, can you give me some examples of those misconceptions that people might have about kickboxing?
There aren't many misconceptions from the outside world. Okay. So, like, people looking in, the spectators, people who don't partake in these sports, they look in and they say, "Oh, it's a violent sport. Oh, it's a blood sport," because it is.
Yeah.
It's a violent sport.
Well, you said blood.
What people don't understand is that it's a very respectful place to be. You have a lot of respect for your opponent. You have a lot of respect for the people involved in the hard work, and there's not a lot of animosity. Like there is going into the ring. You go into the ring to hurt someone.
Sure. But
they are doing the same thing, and that creates a lot of mutual respect. You're both in there to give it everything you've got. And you see this if you ever watch any combat sports, especially MMA. It's probably the biggest one right now. you watch these guys go out and fight, and no matter what, they hug, they shake hands at the end, they say thanks, good fight. Because there's a lot of respect in putting yourself out there in front of all the people and going one-on-one in a ring or a cage with another person. So, I mean, it is violent, but there's nothing wrong with that. Life is violent, you know? Like, but it's a mutual agreement. It's a duel. It's like jousting. Like, there's a lot of respect there. And I think people sort of overlook that. Other than that, I mean, misconceptions in the coaching world, in the competition world, the only misconceptions that I really see regularly would be one person telling another person there's only one way to do a technique.
Right.
You see it a lot. You see one coach say, "Oh no, you can't do it that way." But then you look at a champion fighter and they're doing it that way.
Sure.
So there's no right or wrong. There's just more or less efficient. There's more or less correct for the moment in time. That's probably about the only two misconceptions that I'd come across.
And you touched a little bit on MMA, mixed martial arts. Do you think that kickboxing has sort of been, I don't know, an important element in the rise of the popularity of mixed martial arts over time?
Absolutely. Like, K1 and the big kickboxing tournaments sort of died out. They died out because MMA took over, because all the kickboxers could make money in MMA. They couldn't really make it in some of the kickboxing organizations as they started to fall apart.
Sure.
But one of the predominant styles of MMA athletes is Muay Thai, or variations of it. So you see, all the kicks, generally speaking, have been Muay Thai-style kicks or kickboxing-style kicks for the last couple decades of MMA. What we're seeing now, though, is a resurgence of traditional kicks. So your taekwondo and your karate-style snapping kicks and your side kicks and your spinning kicks, which aren't really a big part of kickboxing in general.
Okay.
So we're seeing that resurgence there, but predominantly the base has always been a kickboxing base for your stand-up game.
Okay. And I've noticed in MMA they have a big emphasis on also being able to grapple well, so jiu-jitsu and styles like this as well that have come in.
Yeah, well, I mean, MMA it started in Brazil, and when it came to the main international stage was through the UFC, run by the Gracie brothers, which are the sort of inventors of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and it was a showcase for them to show off how basically the grappling game, the Jiu-Jitsu game, could dominate all other styles. And if you look at the first UFC 1, the last two people standing in this multi-modal tournament, so you had sumo wrestlers, you had boxers, you had wrestlers, you had karate, you had kung fu practitioners. So this is before we had the mixed martial arts. Before
the integrating of martial arts.
Yeah,
okay. Right.
Yeah, and so it became this sort of one style of all the arts. But the last two people standing were a Gracie, a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner, and a kickboxer.
Right, okay.
And if I remember correctly, his background was actually, I want to say Sabat. I can't remember. It's been a while since I've seen it, but I think it's Sabat, so French kickboxer.
Yeah.
And they were the last two people. And because nobody had any experience in grappling, except some of the wrestlers, but not in this style of grappling, in submission wrestling, the grappler won. So the kickboxer was taken out and lost, but he came second.
Sure. So it became very important to be able to grapple, and a lot of the mixed martial artists today have gotten into.
But we saw those two dominant styles, and that's still basically your foundation of most MMA practitioners, or historically speaking, it's changing a bit now, but it's kickboxing and some form of grappling.
Right. Fantastic. And what does kickboxing mean for you? I know you do boxing predominantly now, but what does it mean for you? What have you taken from it personally?
I mean, for me as a coach, it's a great. How can I put this? So, so often we have this idea that the Eastern martial arts, and there's so many books on it, like they're these self-development arts. They're all about the self-improvement. They're an internal journey. It's a spiritual thing. And people think that the Western combat sports, your boxing, your wrestling, your kickboxing, they are less than. They are not as capable. But I would heartily disagree. Boxing, kickboxing, MMA, they are avenues for self-expression and self-discovery. It's the same as any physical endeavor. You know, if your thing's yoga, do yoga. If your thing's kung fu, do kung fu. But a physical avenue for internal expression and self-discovery is what every person needs. And for me, it's been the combat sports. And, you know, starting off with MMA and then really getting into kickboxing, you know, is when I really first started learning how to move, how to transfer, you know, the energy from one part of body into the other, the you know, the trial and the difficulty of sparring and fighting with people, the difficulty of pushing through the aches and pains you get from training, and really learning more about yourself. And that's what it's always been for me. It's self-discovery. Mm-hmm. And when I coach, you know, I try to implement that or show that to people when they train, and be like, this is, you know, you're here to have fun. You're here to learn about yourself and become better. It doesn't really matter what your art is too much, but I find that the combat sports allow people to really push themselves. And in the environments in which I work, it's a very inclusive environment. So everyone's pushing themselves together, and everyone is really rooting for everyone else.
Sure, exactly. And so if you had someone walking into your gym and said, Josh, I want to do kickboxing, what are the words that you would say to this person, and the advice you would give to them before they decided to actually do kickboxing?
Why do you want to do it?
Sure.
What do you want to get out of it?
Yeah.
Because really, as much as I love these sports, I won't say it's for everyone.
Sure.
You know, because I mean, it isn't. There's no one thing for everyone. But I would ask, what are your goals? What do you want to get out of this? Why do you want to do this? And if they say it looks fun, that's cool. That's where I started. Okay. That's why I still do it. It's fun. But I'd like to know what brought them in the door and what they're really looking for. So at least I can tailor the experience to their goals, which is what I do as a personal trainer. You know, I find their goals and I tailor the experience to those goals.
And what would you like to see for kickboxing in the future?
Kind of what I'm doing now with this kickboxing group here in Victoria. You know, this transition from purely cardio kickboxing groups to that sort of technique focus for the general population, because that's the group I work with. I've worked with athletes in all sorts of sports, and I like that. So what I'd really like to see for the future of kickboxing is sort of what I'm involved with now. So I'm working with a group here in Victoria, BC, called Balance Kickboxing. And at first I was a little skeptical coming on board because I'm sort of opposed to that just cardio whatever idea. I don't like exercise for the sake of exercise. I don't like taking something that's very technical and saying, do a whole lot of this until you're nauseous for your conditioning, because people don't know how to do it, and there's a lot of injury risk. So what we're doing now, and this is the reason I came on board with this group, is the fact that we're getting general people in who are interested in the conditioning aspect, but we're taking a very inclusive environment. So very, very friendly. We just like to make sure everyone's enjoying themselves, but learning. So we have a lot of what we call TechCon classes, technical conditioning, in which we get everyone moving, get the heart rates up, make them work a bit, but then we spend the majority of the class focusing on learning techniques like you would in a kickboxing gym or like you would in a boxing gym or wherever. You're learning techniques. And we have a lot of coaches on the floor. So if we got 10 people, we have 2 or 3 coaches so everyone gets attention. And we focus on that technique. Yeah, we have a really good coach to trainee ratio. And we focus on those techniques and we make sure people are doing them well. And then we condition. We've learned the technique, and then we can use them to develop some level of cardiovascular fitness, and then we finish off with like a circuit. So we're taking that general interest, the person who's like, I just want to get in shape, I want to lose a few pounds, and we're taking them into an environment in which they normally would go in and then just exercise for the sake of exercise.
Sure.
But this way, people are learning how to do stuff. They're learning some skills, which means they can actually throw a kick, throw a punch, block a kick, block a punch in a real world setting, and they're still getting exercise. And so that's the kind of realm that I like to work in, because athletes are fun, but there's just something particularly rewarding about getting new people off the street who had no idea what they're getting into, and showing them how empowering it can be to learn new skills and get in shape. And it sounds kind of corny, especially saying it, hearing myself say it. That's why I coach. Like, I like working with people and seeing them learn new things and feel more empowered because of it, because then they want to keep doing it. So it's all about that longevity of training. People go to these cardio classes and they just get beat up. Like, they just work themselves till they throw up and they can't train anymore because they get injuries. But taking that focus to learning technique, and then after that training, after that getting your conditioning, we reduce the injury rate, we get more people involved, more people get in shape, more people are healthier, more people have fun and want to keep doing it. And so I want to sort of bridge that gap and see more people do this where they take away, it's not a fight gym, it's not just a cardio class. You're here to learn stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really what I want to see more of in the future. Is I want more average people learning how to defend themselves and get in shape and have fun doing it.
Sounds like a fantastic view, Josh.
Thanks.
Thank you, Josh, for the interview today, and thank you, listeners out there. I hope you took away some wonderful insights from Josh about kickboxing. And if you're interested in kickboxing, go on down to your local kickboxing gym in Pavia and ask about how to get involved with kickboxing in the future. Thank you very much today. This is Michael Richards signing off from Sports and Culture with Radio Kekotom.
Grazie Michael e grazie Ivan che sono intervenuti nella nostra puntata. Io vi ricordo dove trovarci: RCT Sport su Facebook, Radio Kekotom su Spreaker. Ci troviamo giovedì prossimo con Sport Connecting People, ma non dimenticate che sabato c'è Serie A City, lunedì prossimo Cantiere Sport, martedì Buzzer Beater con il basket e mercoledì Bandiera Scacchi. Quindi è un giro che continua e si riavvolge su se stesso. Voi restate con noi e sarete intrattenuti a dovere, o almeno al meglio delle nostre possibilità. Un saluto da Tommaso Marconi, un buon proseguimento di giornata da RCT.